Every town has a place people don't talk about. Not on a dare, not on a bet, not even in the daylight. A place that exists in the spaces between what is real and what refuses to stay buried. In the small town of Harrows Creek, a nowhere town perched on the edge of a forgotten county, that place was Shepherd's Field Cemetery. It had been there longer than anyone could remember, longer than the church that sat beside it, which itself had been there since before the Civil War. The oldest headstone, a cracked slab of dark granite near the north wall, bore a date that no one could quite read anymore. The numbers had worn away to shadows. People in Harrows Creek had a rule. It wasn't written down. It wasn't spoken aloud at town meetings or printed in the local paper. It was simply known, the way you know not to touch a hot stove, the way you know not to swim after dark in a lake where someone drowned. You do not enter Shepherd's Field Cemetery after midnight. My name is Daniel Marsh. I grew up 3 blocks from those iron gates, and I was 17 years old when I broke that rule. I'm going to tell you what happened, but more importantly, I'm going to tell you what was already happening long before I ever walked through those gates, because my story is just one thread in a tapestry that goes back generations. A tapestry woven from fear, from grief, and from something that lives in that cemetery. Something that has no name in any language I know. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you're going to understand why some rules should never, ever be broken. To understand what Shepherd's Field is, you have to understand what Harrows Creek used to be. In 1843, a preacher named Elias Shepherd settled the land with 12 families from the Appalachian foothills. They were hard people, Calvinist, suspicious of outsiders, deeply superstitious in the particular way that only people who've survived real hardship can be. They didn't call their superstitions superstitions. They called them precautions. Elias Shepherd donated the land for the cemetery himself. According to the town records, which I spent 3 weeks reading at the county archives, he was very specific about the boundaries. He drove the corner posts himself at what he called the hours of protection: dawn, noon, dusk, and midnight. That detail, midnight, should have told me something. But I was 17, and 17-year-olds are very good at ignoring the things that should tell them something. The first strange reports came within a decade of the cemetery's founding. A farmhand named Tobias Wells claimed he saw a light drifting between the graves at 2 in the morning. When he approached the gate, the light stopped moving and turned toward him. He ran and didn't stop until he reached the next county. Over the following century, the reports accumulated. A woman who went to lay flowers at her husband's grave at 11:30 at night and returned home with no memory of the next 4 hours. A gravedigger in 1912 who refused to finish a burial because he said the grave talked back when he struck the earth with his shovel. 2 teenagers in 1967, a boy and a girl, who went in on a dare and came out separately from opposite ends of the cemetery, 20 minutes apart, neither able to explain how they'd become separated or what had happened in between. And then there was the incident in 1989, the one that turned the unwritten rule into gospel. A group of 4 college students, visiting from the state university 40 miles away, decided Shepherd's Field would make a perfect location for a ghost hunting video. This was before ghost hunting was a television genre, before people did it for views or clout. These 4 kids did it purely for the thrill. 3 of them came home. The 4th, a young man named Christopher Halley, was found at dawn, seated upright against a headstone near the center of the cemetery, his camera in his lap. He was alive, breathing, physically uninjured. But he never spoke again. Not a word. Not a sound. He was transferred to a psychiatric facility and lived there for the next 23 years until he died of natural causes, still silent, still sitting upright whenever they allowed him to. The footage on his camera was 6 hours of static, except for the last 40 seconds, which no one who has seen it will describe in detail. The detective who reviewed it as part of the investigation retired the following week and moved to another state. I was a junior in high school the autumn this happened. It was October, though I'd like to be clear that what made this October significant was not the calendar. The cemetery didn't care about Halloween. It predated our holidays by a long time. My friend Marcus was the one who dared me. That's how these things always start, isn't it? A friend.
A dare. A need to prove something to yourself that you can't quite name. Marcus had grown up hearing the same stories I had. The difference was that Marcus didn't believe in anything he couldn't photograph or measure. He was going to be an engineer. He thought ghost stories were for people who didn't understand statistics. Marcus. It's a cemetery, Danny. Nothing happens in cemeteries. They're the safest places in the world. Everybody there is already dead. Which was, I would later understand, exactly the wrong way to think about it. We planned it for a Friday night in mid-October, when the leaves had turned and the nights came early and cold. There were supposed to be 5 of us. Marcus, me, my girlfriend at the time whose name was Sophie, a quiet kid from our history class named Owen, and Marcus's cousin Ren, who was visiting from out of town. Ren was the only one who refused. Ren, I know you all think it's a joke, but my grandmother grew up here, and she made me promise, she specifically made me promise, never to go near that place at night. I'm not doing it. We laughed. Marcus told her she'd been listening to too many old women. She looked at him with an expression I still think about sometimes. Not fear, exactly. Something older than fear. Ren, when you come back out, you come right to me. All of you. You come right to me and you count off. You make sure everyone is accounted for. Do you understand me? We agreed, the way teenagers agree to things, without listening, without meaning it. We thought she was being dramatic. We arrived at the gates at 11:40, 20 minutes before midnight. The plan was to go in, walk to the center of the cemetery where there was an old stone bench, sit there for 15 minutes, and come back out. Simple. Clean. Deniable. The gates were not locked. They never were. I had always found that strange. A cemetery with unlocked gates. But the old-timers in town would tell you, when pressed, that locks on the gates didn't matter. What mattered was the hour. What mattered was the rule. The moment we stepped through the gates, I felt it. I don't know how to describe it to someone who hasn't experienced it. It wasn't fear. I was already afraid. That was the baseline. This was something different. A weight. A pressure behind the eyes, like the beginning of a headache, but slower. More deliberate. As if something had noticed that we had arrived and was taking its time turning to look at us. Marcus felt nothing. He was already walking ahead, phone out, filming. Sophie held my hand tighter than usual. Owen said nothing. Owen rarely said anything. But I saw him look back at the gate, and I saw something flicker in his expression. A calculation, a reassessment, that I should have paid attention to. The cemetery was larger than it looked from the street. That was the first thing I noticed once we were inside. The paths wound between sections in ways that didn't quite make geometric sense. Left turns that seemed to bring you back where you started. Straight paths that ended at walls that shouldn't have been there. Marcus said it was just because it was dark. He was probably right. Probably. We reached the stone bench at about 11:55, 5 minutes to midnight. Marcus sat down, triumphant, and spread his arms wide. Marcus. See? Nothing. Not a single ghost. Not one skeleton. Just some old rocks with dead people under them. Sophie was looking at a headstone about 10 feet to our left. I noticed her because she had stopped moving. Completely stopped. Not just standing still, but arrested, the way you freeze when you see something that your brain needs a moment to process. Sophie. Daniel. Daniel. Narrator. I crossed to her in 2 steps. The headstone she was looking at was recent, newer than the ones around it. The granite was still dark and unweathered.
The inscription read, Marcus J. Ellery, 1996 to 2013. He went in to see Marcus's full name was Marcus James Ellery. He was 17 years old. He had been born in 1996. The grave was his. For a moment, none of us said anything. The world had a quality to it that I associate with certain moments of trauma, a crystalline slowness where every detail registers with painful clarity and nothing makes sense. Marcus, reading the stone. That's not funny. Who did this? This is a prank. Someone from school. Sophie. Marcus. Marcus, the grave is settled. The ground is settled. This wasn't dug recently. She was right. The earth over the grave had the compacted, permanent quality of soil that had been undisturbed for years. The grass growing over it was the same long, tangled grass as everywhere else in the cemetery. Marcus stepped back. Then again, his phone was still recording. Marcus, this isn't real. This can't be. That was when midnight struck. I don't know if you've ever heard a church bell toll at midnight in a very quiet place. There is something about the sound, the repetition of it, the weight of each stroke, that changes the quality of the air, like a metronome marking a transition from one state to another. When the 12th bell finished echoing, the cemetery was different. I can't tell you how exactly. The physical geography was the same. The headstones were where they'd been. The paths were where they'd been. The sky above was the same October sky. But something had shifted in the way you perceive a room when you realize there is someone else in it. Someone you didn't see when you walked in. We were not alone. There was a figure standing at the far end of the central path, about 60 feet away. It was the silhouette of an elderly man, hunched, thin, wearing what appeared to be a dark coat. He was facing us. He was not moving. We were not moving either. Then Owen, quiet Owen, who never said anything, said very softly, Owen, there are more of them. I looked. He was right. On either side of the central path, emerging from behind headstones, standing among the trees at the edge of the cemetery, figures. Not solid, not quite there. The way something is when you see it in your peripheral vision, and it disappears when you look directly at it. But there were dozens of them, and they were all facing us. I want to pause here and tell you something that I only learned later. Much later, after it was over. After I'd had years to research and reconstruct what had happened that night, and what had been happening in that cemetery for over 150 years. What I learned is this. Shepherd's Field is not a haunted cemetery in the way most people think about haunted places. It isn't haunted by victims. It isn't haunted by tragedy, though there has been plenty of that. It is haunted, if haunted is even the right word, by something more like memory, by an accumulation of endings, and by the specific gravity that accumulates when enough endings happen in one place over enough time. The figures we saw that night were not malevolent. They were not trying to harm us. They were something much stranger and much sadder. They were the impression left behind by people who had not wanted to leave. People whose connection to the world of the living was strong enough, or unresolved enough, that some echo of them persisted in the place where they were buried. They were, in the most literal sense, the weight of all those unfinished goodbyes. That didn't make them any less terrifying when you were 17 years old and standing in the middle of their home at midnight. Marcus grabbed my arm. Marcus, we need to go. Right now. We need to... But the figure at the end of the path had moved. It was closer now, 20 feet instead of 60. Neither of us had seen it move. It had simply advanced, the way time advances, imperceptibly, until suddenly it has gone much further than you realized. Sophie stepped forward. I still don't know why. She would tell me later that she wasn't brave. She was simply more afraid of the unknown behind us than the unknown in front. Sophie. Hello? Pause. Long silence. The figure tilted its head.
It was the gesture of someone listening, someone who had not been spoken to in a very long time and was taking a moment to remember how. And then, in a voice that came from everywhere at once, from the ground, from the air, from inside the bones of my chest, it answered. The voice. You shouldn't be here. Sophie, we know. We're sorry. We were trying to leave. Silence. Then, the voice. Not you. You shouldn't be here yet. You have time. What followed was not a conversation in the ordinary sense. It was more like a transmission, like receiving a signal that your body understands before your mind does. The voice spoke to each of us in turn. To Owen, it said something in a language none of us recognized. But Owen closed his eyes and nodded once, slowly, as if he understood. To Marcus, it said nothing at all. It simply looked at the headstone, his headstone, and then back at him, and Marcus sat down on the bench as if his legs had decided to stop cooperating. To me, it said, the voice. Your grandfather brought something home from this place. A name. Names have weight. They should be returned. I didn't understand then. I understand now. Then it said something that none of us expected. Something that shifted the entire tenor of the night from terror to something else. Something I can only call grief, enormous and quiet, like an ocean at low tide. The voice. We do not want company. We want to be remembered. Those are different things. Tell them. Tell the ones who come at night with their cameras and their dares. We do not want to be found. We want to be held in mind. And then it was gone. The figures were gone. The cemetery was just a cemetery again. Cold and dark and ordinary. The way a place is when whatever occupied it has stepped back behind whatever door separates what is from what was. Marcus stood up. He looked at his headstone for a long moment. Then he turned and walked to the gate without speaking. Wren was waiting exactly where she'd said she'd be, on the low stone wall across the street from the cemetery gates. When she saw us come through, she stood up and counted. 1, 2, 3, 4. Her face did something complicated. Relief and dread and old knowledge all at once. Wren, you all came out. Marcus, did you think we wouldn't? She didn't answer that. We went to an all-night diner 2 towns over and sat in a booth until 4 in the morning, drinking coffee and not talking about it. The not talking about it was its own kind of language, a shared understanding that whatever had happened was real and was serious and needed time to settle before it could be examined. Marcus changed that year, not in ways that would be obvious to someone who didn't know him well. He still got good grades, still applied to engineering programs, still laughed at the right moments. But he became careful, thoughtful in a way he hadn't been before. He started volunteering at his grandmother's nursing home on weekends. When I asked him why, he said, Marcus, someone should spend time with people who are almost gone, before they are. He graduated, went to college, became an engineer. He is alive and well. The headstone in Shepherd's Field still bears his name. I've looked it up in the county records. It was placed there in 1998, when Marcus was 2 years old, by a woman whose name appears nowhere else in any document I've been able to find. The stone is real. The burial record attached to it is real. But the grave is empty. I have no explanation for this. I've stopped trying to find one. Owen moved away the following spring and we lost touch. Years later, I heard through mutual friends that he had become a linguist, that he had spent his career working on dying languages, languages that were disappearing from the world because the last speakers were getting old. He spent his life, in other words, helping things be remembered before they were gone. Sophie and I broke up the following summer for entirely ordinary teenage reasons. She's fine. She lives in a city far from Harrows Creek and doesn't talk about that night. When I reached out to her a few years ago to ask if I could include her in this account, she said yes, on one condition. Sophie, tell people it wasn't evil. It wasn't scary in the way horror movies are scary. It was sad. Like, imagine crying at something beautiful. That kind of sad. I told her I would. So, it was sad. Like crying at something beautiful.
I told you, the voice said, my grandfather had brought something home. A name. I didn't understand what that meant for 2 years. Then my grandmother, cleaning out my grandfather's study after he passed, found a small leather notebook at the back of his desk drawer. On the inside cover, in his handwriting, were 2 lines. Found in Shepherd's Field, November 1962. Must be returned when I am gone. Below it was a name. Not mine, not anyone I recognized. An old name, a name from another century, written in careful, deliberate script. I went back to the cemetery the following week. In daylight. I'm not an idiot. I found the headstone that matched the name in my grandfather's notebook. It was near the north wall, one of the oldest in the cemetery, the date worn to shadows. I set the notebook down against the base of the stone. I said the name out loud, once, the way you'd say the name of someone you'd been meaning to call. Then I left. I haven't been back. I don't think I need to go back. I think some things, when you understand what they need, are resolved simply by providing it. Not every mystery ends with a revelation. Some end with an act of courtesy, a name returned, a goodbye finally said. Every town has a place people don't talk about, and the reason those places exist, the reason the stories accumulate around them, the reason the rules form, is not always because the place is dangerous. Sometimes it's because the place is sacred, and we've forgotten what sacred means. It means set apart. It means this is not for you to consume or explore or document. This is for something else. Something older than your curiosity, older than your dare, older than your need to prove to yourself that nothing in the world is beyond the reach of your understanding. The dead of Shepherd's Field were not asking to be left alone out of malice. They were asking to be held in mind, to be remembered as people, not as an attraction, to have their names spoken with care, not with a camera running for the entertainment of strangers. I've thought a lot about the voice in the cemetery and what it was really saying. I think it was saying what any of us would say if we could speak from the other side of the final door. Don't come looking for us, just don't forget us. There is a cemetery in Harrows Creek called Shepherd's Field. The gates are never locked. The rule is still in force. I'm not going to tell you what to do with that information. I trust you to understand what it means. I need you to hear me out before you decide whether or not you believe this. I've been debating whether to tell this story for almost 3 months now. I kept telling myself, nobody will believe you. They'll say you imagined it. They'll say grief does things to people. Maybe they're right. Maybe grief does do things to people. But grief doesn't make footsteps appear behind you on an empty street at 2 in the morning. Grief doesn't leave handprints on the inside of a window that no one could reach from outside. I visited a cemetery on October 12th. I left alone. Or at least, I thought I did. Before I get into the details of that night, I want to give you some context, because without it, none of this makes any sense. I'm not a paranormal investigator. I don't run ghost hunting channels. I don't seek out this kind of thing. Up until 3 months ago, I would have laughed at anyone who told me a story like the one I'm about to tell you. I'm a skeptic. I'm practical. I believe in science. And none of that has changed. What has changed is that I now know, deeply, undeniably know, that there are things in this world that science hasn't caught up to yet. Let me start from the beginning. My grandmother passed away in August. Her name was Eleanor. She was 84 years old, and she was the most important person in my life. She wasn't sick for long. That's the hardest part. 6 weeks from diagnosis to gone. We barely had time to process that we were losing her before she was already lost. She was buried in Westfield Memorial Cemetery, a place I'd only been to twice before, both times as a child, both times holding her hand while she visited her own parents' graves. There's something poetic about that, I think. She used to take me there on Sunday mornings. She'd lay fresh flowers, always white carnations, and she'd talk to her mother as if she were standing right there next to us. I used to think it was strange. Now I understand it completely. 2 months after the funeral, I still hadn't been back. My family had visited several times, but I kept making excuses. Work, distance, traffic. The truth is, I wasn't ready. The grave made it real in a way that nothing else had. But on October 11th, I had a dream. In the dream, my grandmother was standing in the cemetery. She was wearing the blue coat she always wore in autumn, and she was waving to me, not desperately, not urgently, just waving, like she was saying, "Come visit." I woke up at 4 in the morning and couldn't get back to sleep. By 7 a.m., I had already decided I was going the next day. I didn't tell anyone. I just needed it to be quiet and personal and mine. That was my first mistake. I arrived at Westfield Memorial just after 4 p.m. Later than I'd planned. I'd gotten stuck in traffic on the way out of the city. The sky was doing that thing it does in October where the light is amber and dim, like the sun is already giving up for the day. There were maybe 3 or 4 other people visible across the grounds, scattered far apart. The kind of quiet that you don't often feel anywhere except old cemeteries and empty churches. I found her grave easily. The stone was still relatively new, the granite still bright, the engraving sharp. Eleanor Ruth Chambers, beloved mother, grandmother, friend. I sat on the ground next to her grave. My jeans got completely muddy, and I did not care even a little bit, and I talked to her. For a long time. The way she used to talk to her parents. I told her I missed her. I told her about work. I told her the garden at my parents' house had finally bloomed the way she always said it would if my dad would just leave it alone. I laughed a little. I cried a lot. And then something happened. While I was sitting there, I heard footsteps on the gravel path behind me. I assumed it was another visitor, so I didn't turn around immediately. But the footsteps stopped, and they didn't move again. After about 30 seconds of silence, I looked over my shoulder. The path was empty. Both directions. No one. The nearest other visitor was maybe 100 meters away with their back to me. I told myself it was an animal. A bird. The wind threw dead leaves on gravel. Perfectly explainable. I turned back to my grandmother's stone, stayed another 15 minutes, and then gathered my things to leave. That was around 5:20 p.m. The sky had deepened to a dark gray. The cemetery was nearly empty. I walked back toward the main gate, and that's when I first noticed it. The parking lot at Westfield Memorial is about a 4-minute walk from the older section of the cemetery where my grandmother is buried. You pass through this narrow lane lined with old oak trees, the kind with roots that buckle the asphalt path underneath. I was walking through that section when I felt it. A weight, not physical, more like a pressure change. Like when you walk into a room and can immediately sense that someone is in it, even before you see them. I am very sensitive to that feeling. I always have been. Some people call it hypervigilance, I guess. I've always just called it instinct. My instincts were screaming. I slowed my pace and listened. No footsteps, no voices, no wind at that moment, actually. The trees were completely still, but the feeling didn't leave. It intensified. I turned around, quickly, not gradually. Empty path, trees on both sides. No one. I stood there for a long moment. Then I turned back and walked faster. I got to my car, got in, locked the doors, which I noted was an odd impulse in a parking lot with 2 other cars in it, and I sat there for a minute. The feeling had faded.
but it hadn't completely gone. I remember thinking, "You're emotional. You've been crying for half an hour. Your nervous system is heightened. This is just anxiety." That is a very rational and reasonable explanation that I completely believed. Right up until I checked my rearview mirror and saw a shape in the back seat. I want to be careful about how I describe this because I never want to exaggerate or over-dramatize it for effect. It wasn't a figure. It wasn't a person. It was a darkness. A concentrated, dense shadow in the left rear corner of my car, in a car that, at that moment, had the overhead lights on. I spun around in my seat. Nothing. Empty back seat. The overhead light was fine. I chalked it up to a trick of light. Reflections in rearview mirrors are strange. I'd been emotional. My eyes were tired from crying. I drove home. I live about 45 minutes from the cemetery. The drive was fine. I had music on. I was decompressing. And by the time I turned onto my street, I felt almost normal. Almost. I pulled into my driveway at 6:15 p.m. My neighbor was walking her dog across the street and waved at me. Normal evening. I grabbed my bag, went inside, fed my cat, her name is Miso, and started making tea. Miso had been asleep on the couch when I walked in. Standard greeting. She lifted her head, made a chirping sound, and settled back down. But about 10 minutes after I got home, while I was in the kitchen, I heard Miso make a sound I had never heard from her before. Not a hiss, not a meow. It was low, sustained, almost like a growl but hollow, like a sound designed to ward something off. I walked into the living room. Miso was standing on the couch, facing the hallway, specifically facing the front door. Every hair on her back was raised. Her tail was 3 times its normal size. She was staring at the door, unblinking. I called her name. She didn't respond. She just kept staring. She did that for 11 minutes. I timed it, because after about 4 minutes, I got my phone out and started recording, just in case. After 11 minutes, she shook herself, walked across the couch, head-butted my hand, and curled up like nothing had happened. But I couldn't stop staring at that door. That night, I went to bed at around 11 p.m. I was genuinely exhausted, emotionally drained from the cemetery visit. I fell asleep quickly. At 3:14 a.m., I woke up. Not gradually, not from a dream, just awake, instantly, completely alert. The room was normal, quiet. Miso was curled at the foot of my bed, which is usual, except she wasn't sleeping. She was awake, and she was looking at the corner of the room near my closet. I followed her gaze. The corner was shadowed. My nightlight doesn't quite reach that far. But as I stared at it, I began to have the overwhelming sense that something was staring back. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. Empty corner. Closet door closed, as I'd left it. Miso looked at me, then back at the corner. Then she lay her head down and closed her eyes. I kept my flashlight on for a while. I'm not sure how long. Eventually, I fell back asleep. In the morning, I assumed I had simply had an unsettled night after an emotional day. I was wrong. Over the next week, strange things happened in my apartment that I kept finding individual rational explanations for. Objects moved, not dramatically, not flying across the room, just relocated. A mug I'd left on the kitchen counter, found on the coffee table. My keys, usually hung by the door, found in a kitchen drawer I never use. My grandmother's photograph, the only one I keep on display, found face down on the shelf. Each one, alone, I could explain. Together, over 7 days? Much harder to dismiss. 7 days after the cemetery visit, at approximately 2 a.m, I heard knocking at my front door. 3 knocks. Distinct, deliberate, not frantic. I assumed it was a neighbor, maybe an emergency. I got up, went to the door, looked through the peephole.
The hallway was empty. I stood at the door for a moment, then went back to bed, assuming I had dreamed it. It happened again the next night. Same time, same 3 knocks. And the night after that. On the 4th night, I set up my laptop camera to record the hallway outside my door all night. The footage shows 3 distinct shadow movements at 2:03 a.m. passing in front of my door. No person, no shape, just a disruption in the light, like something passing through it. And then, 3 knocks, visible vibration in the door, no one there. At this point, I finally told someone, my friend Dara, who is a nurse and possibly the most pragmatic person I know. I was prepared for her to tell me I needed sleep and a therapist. Instead, she came over that evening and walked through my entire apartment. She didn't say much. When she got to the corner of my bedroom, the corner Miso kept watching, she stopped. She stood there for almost a minute. Then she said, very quietly, "Something's here." I asked her what she meant. She said, "I don't know, but something is here, and it's in this corner." Dara has never, in 10 years of friendship, said anything remotely like that. She's the person who makes fun of haunted house tourists. She's the person who explained to me once in clinical detail why ghosts are neurologically impossible. She looked shaken, and that frightened me more than anything that had happened up to that point. 12 days after the cemetery visit, I was cleaning my apartment. I was wiping down the inside of my bedroom window, the one that faces the back alley, 1 floor down. There were handprints on the glass, on the inside. 3 of them, pressed flat, like someone had leaned against the glass with their palms open. I pressed my own hand against one of them to compare. The prints were smaller than my hands, not dramatically, maybe by an inch, but distinctly smaller. I photographed them immediately. Then I sat on the floor of my bedroom for about 20 minutes trying to think of any possible explanation. I have no children. No one had visited my apartment. No one had cleaned the windows. The window had been locked since I moved in. I had no explanation. I cleaned the handprints off the glass. The next morning, they were back. I called my mother. I know that sounds strange, but my mother grew up in a family that took these things seriously. Her grandmother, my great-grandmother, had a very grounded, matter-of-fact relationship with the supernatural. She didn't dramatize it. She just dealt with it when it came up. I told my mother everything. The cemetery, the shadow in the car, Miso, the knocking, the handprints. There was a long silence. Then she said, "Did you bring anything home from the cemetery?" I thought about it. No. I hadn't taken any flowers, any stones, any soil. I'd brought nothing. She asked, "Did you touch any other graves?" I had. When I was navigating through the older section to reach my grandmother's plot, I had steadied myself against a grave marker, one of those old, weathered ones from the 1800s. A long pause on the line. Then my mother said, "You need to go back to the cemetery and ask it to leave." I spent 2 days researching before I went back. What I found was surprisingly consistent across cultures and time periods. The idea that cemeteries are liminal spaces, thresholds between the living world and something else, and that what exists in those thresholds can sometimes attach to the living, not always maliciously. In many traditions, these attachments happen when a spirit is confused or lonely or looking for something familiar. The grave I had touched belonged, according to cemetery records I found online, to a woman named Agnes Whitmore, died 1887, age unknown, wife and mother. I don't know why she attached to me if that's what happened, but I was beginning to believe that it had. I went back on a Saturday morning. Dara came with me. She insisted, and honestly, I was grateful. We walked to my grandmother's grave first. I sat with her for a while, told her what had been happening, asked her to watch over me. I want to clarify. I'm not a religious person. I don't have a structured belief system. But standing at my grandmother's grave, asking for her presence and protection, it didn't feel irrational. It felt right. Then we walked to Agnes Whitmore's grave. The stone was older than I'd remembered. It had sunk partially into the ground. The inscription was barely legible. I knelt beside it. Dara stood a few feet back, and I spoke out loud, calmly, clearly, without any theatrical energy. I simply said, "If something of this place has come home with me, I'm asking it now, with respect, to return here. This is where you belong, not in my home, not with me. Here, with your own." I laid white carnations on both graves, my grandmother's flowers. The choice felt right. And then we left. That afternoon, Miso spent 3 hours in the corner she'd been watching. Not fearfully, just sitting there, watching, the way cats watch things we can't see. But it was different. She wasn't alarmed. She was calm, curious almost. By evening, she had lost interest entirely and was back to her usual spots. That night, I slept from 11 p.m. until 7 a.m. without waking once. No knocking. The next morning, the window was clean. It has now been 2.5 months since I went back to the cemetery. The knocking stopped. It has not returned. The handprints never came back. Miso returned to normal. She sleeps in her usual spots. She greets me at the door again. The objects in my apartment have stayed where I put them, and the feeling, that presence, that weight I described, it lifted. Gradually, over about a week after the second cemetery visit, like a pressure system moving through. Whatever it was, it left. I want to talk about what I think actually happened, because I've had months to sit with it. I don't think I was haunted by a malevolent spirit. I don't think Agnes Whitmore, whoever she was, meant me harm. I think grief opened something in me. My grandmother's death, the rawness of sitting at her grave, the emotional state I was in, it made me, in some way, more permeable, more available to connection. And something found me. Whether it was Agnes's spirit, or some energy attached to that old stone, or something entirely beyond the categories we have for these things, I can't say. What I can say is this: it was real. And returning to the cemetery and asking it to leave, that was also real. And it worked. I don't have a tidy framework for any of this. I'm still a skeptic, in the sense that I want evidence and I distrust easy answers. But skepticism should make room for experience, and this was my experience. There's one more thing. About a week after the knocking stopped, the first night I slept completely peacefully, I had another dream. My grandmother was in her garden, the one at my parents' house. She was wearing her blue coat, and the garden was exactly the way she always said it would be if my dad would leave it alone. She looked at me and said, "You handled that well, sweetheart." And then she went back to her flowers. I woke up and I genuinely felt okay, for the first time since August. I don't know if that was her. I don't know if dreams work that way, but it felt like a goodbye, and it felt like enough. If you've made it to the end of this, thank you. Genuinely. This took a long time for me to be ready to share, and the fact that you're here listening means something. I know some of you will have explanations. Grief-induced hypervigilance, apophenia, sleep paralysis. I've considered all of them. I respect all of them. I cannot definitively rule any of them out. But I also know what I felt, what I saw, what my cat did, and what stopped when I went back and asked. And I know that the next time I visit my grandmother's grave, which will be soon, because I'm not afraid of that place anymore, I will touch nothing that isn't hers. Leave a comment if you've had an experience like this. I read every single one. You're not alone,
and you don't have to explain yourself to anyone. If this video helped you feel a little less alone in something strange and unexplainable, then it was worth telling.